before the courtrooms and the prison cells, before the negotiations and the inaugurations, before the world learned to speak his name with the particular reverence reserved for those who alter the course of history, there was red earth. There were hills. There was a river winding through grassland under an enormous African sky, and a boy who had not yet become anything except curious, alive, and free. The Transkei region of South Africa's Eastern Cape is one of the oldest inhabited landscapes on the continent, a rolling geography of ancient hills and river valleys that has sustained human life for millennia. The land here is defined by its color, a deep, oxidized red ochre clay that stains everything it touches, that clings to bare feet and cattle hooves, and the foundations of the whitewashed rondavels that dot the hillsides like scattered beads. This is not a dramatic landscape in the manner of mountain ranges or coastlines. Its power is quieter, more patient, the power of continuity, of a land that has absorbed generation after generation into its rhythms and returned them, eventually, to its red soil. The village of Quinu sits within this landscape, as it has for centuries, its cluster of circular mud-walled homes arranged on the slopes above a narrow valley through which a stream runs clear and cold in winter and warm and slow in summer. The Mbash River, broader and more deliberate, winds through the wider grasslands to the east, its banks lined with fever trees and wild fig, its waters carrying the runoff of the Red Hills toward the Indian Ocean coast. In the early decades of the 20th century, Quinu was a community of perhaps several hundred people, its rhythms governed entirely by the agricultural and pastoral calendar. The planting of maize and sorghum in the spring rains, the movement of cattle and goats across the open grazing land in summer, the harvest and the long, cool winters when the hills turned amber and the cooking fires burned longer into the evenings. It was into this world, on July 18, 1918, that Rolihlahla Mandela was born, the son of Nkosi Mfakanius Wagadla Henry Mandela, a chief and councillor of the Tembu people, and his third wife, Noskeni Fanny. The name Rolihlahla in the Xhosa language carries a meaning that would prove almost prophetically apt, roughly translated. It means one who pulls the branch of a tree, a colloquial suggestion of a troublemaker, a disturber of established order. The English name Nelson would come later, assigned by a school teacher in the colonial tradition of replacing indigenous names with European ones. But the first name, the true name, already contained something of the man's destiny within its syllables. The world of Quinu in 1918 was simultaneously ancient and under siege. The Xhosa people had inhabited the Eastern Cape for centuries, developing a sophisticated culture built around cattle herding, agriculture, oral tradition, and a complex system of governance rooted in lineage, consensus, and the authority of chiefs and elders. The Tembu, one of the Xhosa-speaking peoples, maintained their own royal lineage and their own traditions of leadership, traditions that would prove formative for the young Mandela in ways that would only become fully apparent decades later, when he stood before the world as a statesman whose understanding of power was inseparable from his understanding of responsibility. But the British colonial administration had been reshaping this landscape for generations. The Transkei had been formally annexed by the Cape Colony in the 1880s, and by the time of Mandela's birth, the region existed in a condition of constrained semi-autonomy, a Xhosa homeland in which traditional structures were permitted to persist under the watchful oversight of colonial authority, their power real within limits carefully defined by those who held the larger power. The pass laws, which required black South Africans to carry documentation permitting their movement, were already a feature of this landscape. The mines of the Witwatersrand, hundreds of miles to the north, were already consuming the labor of men drawn from villages like Quinu by economic necessity and colonial compulsion. The young Mandela grew up in a world that was, in its immediate sensory reality, one of extraordinary richness and beauty. The oral culture of the Xhosa people meant that history, law, and moral philosophy were transmitted through story, through the voices of elders gathered beneath the shade trees on warm afternoons, through the ceremonial occasions that marked the passage of seasons and the transitions of human life. The cattle kraal at the center of village life was not merely a practical enclosure, but a sacred space, the site of ritual and sacrifice, the measure of wealth and standing. The communal cooking fires that burned at dusk were not merely sources of warmth, but gathering places where the community reproduced itself through conversation, laughter, and the transmission of accumulated wisdom. Mandela's father, Nkosi Mfakaniiswa, was a man of considerable local authority, a chief whose counsel was sought by the Tembu regent and whose integrity was, by all accounts, the defining quality of his character. He was also, reportedly, a man of fierce independence who had once defied a colonial magistrate's ruling and paid for it with the loss of his chieftainship and much of his property. This act of principled defiance, the willingness to sacrifice material security rather than compromise one's sense of justice, would echo through the son's life in ways that neither father nor son could have anticipated. When Mandela was approximately 9 years old, his father died of what was likely a lung disease, and the trajectory of the boy's life shifted dramatically. The Tembu regent, Jongintaba Dalindiebo, agreed to become Mandela's guardian, and the boy was taken from Kwanu to the great place at Mqhekisweni, the royal residence of the Tembu regent, a world of considerably greater scale and ceremony than the village of his birth. The great place was a revelation. Where Kwanu had been intimate and pastoral, Mqhekisweni was a seat of governance, a compound of whitewashed buildings arranged around a central courtyard, regularly visited by chiefs, councillors, and petitioners from across the Tembu territory. The regent's home was the largest building Mandela had encountered, its rooms furnished with actual furniture rather than the sleeping mats and clay pots of his childhood home. The ceremonial occasions that punctuated life at the great place, the gatherings of chiefs, the hearings of disputes, the rituals of Tembu governance, were conducted with a formality and gravity that impressed themselves permanently on the young observer. It was here, at the great place, that Mandela first encountered the model of leadership that would shape his own. The regent Jongintaba presided over gatherings with a particular quality of attention, listening carefully to every speaker before offering his own perspective, seeking consensus rather than imposing decision, understanding his authority as a form of service rather than a form of domination. The meetings Mandela witnessed at Mqhekisweni were, in a real sense, his first education in democratic process, in the idea that legitimate governance required the participation and consent of the governed, that the leader's role was to give voice to the community's collective wisdom rather than to substitute his own judgment for it. The landscape of Mqhekisweni was also the landscape of Mandela's formal education. He attended a Methodist mission school near the Great Place, becoming among the first in his family to receive a Western-style education, an education conducted entirely in English, in a curriculum designed by colonial administrators to produce compliant, literate subjects rather than critical, empowered citizens. The tension between this colonial educational project and the indigenous knowledge system in which Mandela was simultaneously being formed would prove generative rather than paralyzing. He would spend his life drawing on both traditions, finding in their combination a breadth of perspective that neither alone could have provided. The hills around Mqhekisweni were the hills of Mandela's adolescence, the landscape of his initiation into manhood through the Xhosa Ulwaluko ceremony, the ritual circumcision that marked the transition from boyhood to adult membership in the community. This ceremony, conducted in the traditional manner, was not merely a physical rite, but a comprehensive cultural transmission, a formal induction into the responsibilities, the history, and the moral obligations of Xhosa manhood. The landscape itself participated in the ritual, the initiates retreating to a designated space in the hills, their period of seclusion marked by the whitened clay that covered their bodies, the return to the community as men accompanied by the burning of their boyhood possessions. The open horizons of the Transkei, those vast, unobstructed skies above the rolling hills, were the visual grammar of Mandela's earliest understanding of what it meant to be alive and free. The land stretched in every direction without barrier or boundary, the cattle moving freely across the grazing commons, the paths between villages open to anyone who wished to walk them. This was the environmental baseline against which everything that followed would be measured. The constrictions of Johannesburg's racial geography, the checkpoints and permit offices of the apartheid state, and ultimately the 8-by-7-foot cell on Robben Island, where a rectangle of sky glimpsed through a single high window would become the only horizon available for 18 years. But that confinement was still decades away. In the red-earthed hills of the Transkei, in the ceremonial compound of the great place at Imkuhekisweni, the young Nelson, Rolihlahla Mandela was absorbing the landscape and the culture and the moral philosophy that would, in time, make him not merely a prisoner or a president, but something rarer and more enduring. A man whose character had been formed by the oldest and deepest traditions of human community, and who would carry those traditions, intact and luminous, through everything the century would demand of him. The red earth of Quinu was not merely the place of his birth. It was the first and most fundamental architecture of his soul. No arrival in the history of South African political life carried more consequence than the one that occurred sometime in 1941, when a young man from the hills of the Transkei stepped off a bus into the roaring, smoke-choked reality of Johannesburg. The red earth of Quinu was behind him. Ahead lay a city that would remake him, and that he, in turn, would help to remake entirely. The journey itself was an act of flight. Mandela had departed the great place at Imkuhekisweni without the regent Jongintaba's blessing, unwilling to submit to an arranged marriage that had been organized on his behalf in the tradition of Tembu custom. The decision to leave was not made lightly. It represented a rupture with the world that had formed him, a rejection of the authority he had been raised to respect. But something in the young man's character, perhaps the same quality encoded in his birth name, refused the constraint. He was 22 years old, and the city was calling with the particular insistence that cities have always used to summon the young and the restless from the countryside. Johannesburg in 1941 was unlike anything the Transkei landscape could have prepared its children to encounter. The city had been born from gold, from the extraordinary discovery of the Witwatersrand Reef in 1886, a geological accident that transformed a featureless high-veld plateau into the economic engine of an empire within a single generation. By the time Mandela arrived, Johannesburg was a city of perhaps 1 million people, its skyline punctuated by Art Deco towers of glass and pale stone that caught the high-veld light with a cold, impersonal gleam. The streets of the white city centre were wide and formally planned, their pavements lined with department stores, banks, and government offices whose marble lobbies and polished brass fittings announced the prosperity of a particular class with architectural confidence. But this gleaming surface was only one geography of Johannesburg. The city existed in a condition of deliberate, engineered duality, a white city of abundance and a black city of controlled deprivation, separated not by accident but by design, the spatial expression of a racial ideology that had been accumulating legislative force since the earliest years of the century. The Natives Land Act of 1913 had already established the principle that black South Africans could own land only within designated reserves, amounting to roughly 7% of the country's territory. The urban areas legislation that followed had built upon this foundation, creating a system in which black workers could be present in white cities only as temporary sojourners. Their labor required, their permanent presence refused, their humanity acknowledged only to the extent that it served the economic interests of those who had organized the system. Alexandra Township, where Mandela first settled, was a particular and vivid expression of this geography. Located approximately 13 kilometers northeast of the city center, Alexandra had been established in the early 20th century as one of the few areas near Johannesburg where black South Africans could own freehold property, a legal anomaly that gave the township a character distinct from the purely municipal locations that surrounded other South African cities. The streets of Alexandra were unpaved, their red dust rising in clouds with every passing vehicle and every gust of the high-veld wind. Corrugated iron shacks pressed against each other along narrow lanes, their walls thin against the cold of the high-veld winter, their roofs drumming with the summer thunderstorms that rolled across the plateau with spectacular violence. The population density was extraordinary. Tens of thousands of people compressed into a small area, sharing communal water taps and outdoor latrines, navigating a daily existence of material scarcity that contrasted with brutal clarity against the prosperity visible in the white suburbs that surrounded the township on every side. It was in this environment that Mandela first encountered the full, unmediated reality of what racial segregation meant in physical, spatial terms. In the Transkei, colonial authority had been a presence, real and constraining, but the land itself had remained open, the horizons unobstructed, the movement of daily life governed by the rhythms of agriculture and community rather than by the demands of a racial bureaucracy. In Johannesburg, the racial order was inscribed into every surface of the built environment. The buses that carried black workers from the townships to the city centre bore signs designating separate entrances. The park benches, the public toilets, the hospital waiting rooms, the counters of government offices, all were divided by the cold geometry of racial classification. The physical world reorganized to make the hierarchy of apartheid legible at every moment of every day. Mandela found work initially as a mine compound security guard, a position that brought him into direct contact with the gold mining industry that was the foundation of Johannesburg's existence. The mines themselves were a landscape of almost geological violence. The headframes of the shaft works rose against the smoke-hazed sky of the southern Witwatersrand, their steel structures silhouetted against sunsets made lurid by the mineral dust that hung perpetually in the air. The mine dumps, vast artificial hills of processed rock from which the gold had been extracted, accumulated on the city's periphery, their pale yellow surfaces bare of vegetation, their contours shifting in the wind, their dust coating the townships that lay downwind with a fine, persistent grit. Underground, in the darkness of the reef, black miners worked in conditions of extreme physical danger for wages that bore no relationship to the wealth they were generating. The contrast between the labor expended and the prosperity it produced, a prosperity concentrated almost entirely in white hands, was the foundational injustice of South African economic life, visible in the landscape for anyone willing to look at it clearly. Mandela did not remain a security guard. Through a combination of determination and fortunate connection, he secured a position as an articled clerk with the Johannesburg law firm of Witkin, Seidelsky and Eidelman, whose partner Laser Seidelsky was willing to employ a black clerk at a time when such employment was exceptional. Simultaneously, he enrolled to complete his Bachelor of Arts degree through the University of South Africa, and subsequently gained admission to the University of the Witwatersrand Law School, becoming one of the very few black students in an institution whose physical environment was organized around the assumption of white occupancy. The Wits campus, with its neo-Gothic sandstone buildings set on the ridge above Johannesburg, was a world of intellectual ambition and racial contradiction, a place where the ideas of liberalism and justice were taught in classrooms from which the majority of South Africans were excluded by law and custom. It was at Wits, and in the political circles that intersected with the university, that Mandela's political education accelerated dramatically. The city was a crucible of ideological encounter in ways that the Transkei could never have been. A place where African nationalists, Indian activists, white communists, and liberal reformers all occupied the same contested urban geography, their ideas colliding and combining in the back rooms of Johannesburg's political underground. The ANC, founded in 1912, maintained its offices and its organizing networks in the city, its meetings held in the cramped spaces available to black political life. Church halls, private homes, the back rooms of businesses operated by sympathetic individuals. The atmosphere of these gatherings was one of electric, urgent purpose. Men and women who understood with perfect clarity the nature of the system they were opposing, debating with passionate intensity the strategies and philosophies that might dismantle it. In 1944, Mandela joined with Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and others to found the ANC Youth League, an organization whose founding represented a generational impatience with the ANC's established leadership, which the young activists regarded as insufficiently militant in its response to the accelerating assault on black rights. The Youth League's founding document called for a more confrontational approach, for mass action rather than polite petition, for the assertion of African nationalism as a positive political force rather than merely a defensive response to colonial oppression. The physical spaces in which the Youth League organized, the cramped meeting rooms, the duplicated pamphlets passed hand to hand, the street corners where conversations were conducted with one eye on the possibility of police surveillance, were the geography of a movement finding its voice and its courage simultaneously. The year 1948 transformed the political landscape of South Africa with the force of a geological event. The National Party's electoral victory, achieved on a platform of apartheid, a word meaning separateness, a bureaucratic euphemism for a system of comprehensive racial domination, brought to power a government committed to the systematic intensification and formalization of racial segregation. The physical consequences were immediate and visible. Apartheid signage began to appear across Johannesburg's public spaces with the methodical thoroughness of a bureaucracy that had been planning this moment for years. The words "Slegs, blanks, whites only" appeared on park benches, on beach entrances, on the doors of post offices and government buildings, on the windows of railway carriages. Each sign a small, cold declaration that the public world belonged to one category of human being and was merely tolerated under strict conditions for the use of others. For Mandela, watching this transformation from within the city that had already shown him the reality of racial power, the National Party's victory was not a surprise, but a clarification. A moment when the implicit was made explicit, when the informal architecture of racial domination was formalized into law with a thoroughness that left no room for ambiguity. The city of gold that had drawn him from the hills of the Transkei had revealed itself, in the years since his arrival, as a city of shadow as much as light. A place where the extraordinary wealth generated by black labor was systematically denied to those who generated it, where the landscape itself had been reorganized to make inequality permanent and visible. The young man who had arrived in 1941 with a law degree to pursue and a political education to begin had, by the decade's end, become something more specific and more dangerous. A man who understood the system completely, who had the intellectual tools to articulate its injustice, and who had found, in the ANC and its Youth League, a community of purpose equal to the scale of what needed to be changed. The city had made him. Now he would begin the long, costly, extraordinary work of remaking it. A system of racial domination, to sustain itself across generations, must do more than pass laws. It must reshape the physical world, reorganize the land, the streets, the distances between human beings, until the hierarchy it enforces appears not as a political choice, but as a natural condition, as inevitable as geography itself. This was the particular genius and the particular horror of apartheid. It built its ideology into the landscape so thoroughly that the landscape itself became an instrument of oppression, and the daily act of moving through space became, for millions of black South Africans, an encounter with the state's absolute authority over their bodies and their lives. The legislative architecture that accomplished this transformation was assembled with bureaucratic precision in the years immediately following the National Party's 1948 electoral victory. The Population Registration Act of 1950 required every South African to be classified by race, white, colored, Indian, or native, with each classification carrying a specific and dramatically different set of rights, restrictions, and life possibilities. The classification process was administered with a grotesque attention to physical detail. Skin tone, hair texture, the shape of fingernails, the testimony of neighbors, all were marshaled as evidence in the determination of which category a human being belonged to, and therefore what kind of life they would be permitted to live. Families were divided by classification decisions that placed siblings in different racial categories. Communities that had existed in the complex, mixed reality of South African social life for generations were suddenly required to sort themselves into the clean, false categories of the apartheid bureaucracy. The Group Areas Act, passed in the same year, translated these classifications into spatial reality. Under its provisions, every urban area in South Africa was designated for the exclusive occupation of a single racial group, and those who found themselves living in areas designated for a different group were subject to forced removal. The consequences were catastrophic for the communities they destroyed. Soweto, a vibrant, densely populated neighborhood on the western edge of Johannesburg, had been one of the few urban areas where black South Africans could own property and where the races mixed with something approaching genuine social complexity. A place of jazz clubs, shebeens, churches, and political ferment, its streets alive with the creative energy of a community that had made something extraordinary from the constrained materials available to it. Beginning in 1955, the apartheid government demolished Soweto systematically, street by street, house by house, displacing its approximately 60,000 residents to the distant township of Meadowlands. In Soweto's place, a white suburb was constructed and named, with deliberate contempt, Triumph, Triumph. The forced removal of Soweto was not an isolated event, but a template replicated across South Africa with industrial thoroughness. District 6 in Cape Town, Kato Manor in Durban, Lady Selborne Inn. Pretoria, vibrant, mixed communities with deep roots and complex social lives were emptied and demolished, their populations deposited in distant townships that had been designed not as communities, but as labor reservoirs. The townships were located at maximum practical distance from the white cities they served, far enough to be invisible from the city center, close enough that workers could be transporting to their jobs in the pre-dawn darkness and returned before nightfall. The physical distance was not accidental. It was a designed feature of the system, ensuring that the labor of black South Africans would be available to white South Africa while their social and political existence remained, as far as possible, out of sight. Soweto, the southwestern townships, was the largest and most consequential expression of this spatial logic. By the mid-20th century, Soweto housed over 1 million people in an area southwest of Johannesburg. Its streets a grid of matchbox houses built to a standardized plan that expressed, in its very uniformity, the apartheid state's view of its black residents as interchangeable units of labor rather than individual human beings. The houses were small, typically 2 or 3 rooms, and were constructed without the infrastructure that white South African suburbs took entirely for granted. Streets were unpaved, their surfaces turning to rivers of red mud in the summer rains and clouds of choking dust in the dry winter months. Running water was intermittent or absent. Sewage systems were inadequate for the population density the township was required to absorb. And on Soweto's horizon, visible from almost every point in the township, stood the cooling towers of the Orlando Power Station, a structure that supplied electricity to white Johannesburg, while the township in whose shadow it stood burned candles and paraffin lamps in the darkness. This was not poverty as accident or historical residue. It was poverty as policy, a designed condition, maintained by the deliberate underfunding of black education, health care, and municipal infrastructure. The Bantu Education Act of 1953 formalized the educational dimension of this design, creating a separate and comprehensively inferior educational system for black South African children. The architect of this system, Hendrik Verwoerd, was explicit about its purpose. Black South Africans should be educated only to the level required for their designated role as hewers of wood and drawers of water in a white-controlled economy. The physical environment of black schools reflected this philosophy with painful literalness. Overcrowded classrooms, absent textbooks, undertrained and underpaid teachers, buildings that were structurally inadequate for the number of students compelled to use them. The pass laws completed the system's spatial logic by controlling the movement of black South Africans through their own country with a comprehensiveness that transformed daily life into a continuous encounter with state authority. Every black South African over the age of 16 was required to carry a passbook, a document that recorded their identity, their racial classification, their employer, their residential permit, and their authorization to be present in any given area. The passbook was required to be produced on demand by any police officer, and failure to produce it, or to have the correct endorsements, resulted in immediate arrest. The pass offices where permits were obtained and renewed were institutions of deliberate humiliation, their queues stretching for hours outside buildings designed to process human beings with the efficiency and impersonality of an abattoir. Their clerks empowered to determine, with a stamp or its absence, whether a person could remain in the city where they worked, or whether they would be endorsed out, removed, by force if necessary, to a homeland they might never have seen. The ANC's response to this accelerating legislative assault was the Defiance Campaign of 1952, a coordinated program of non-violent civil disobedience in which volunteers deliberately violated apartheid laws, entering designated white spaces, using white facilities, refusing to carry passes, and accepting arrest as a form of political testimony. The campaign was the largest organized resistance to apartheid that South Africa had yet seen, drawing thousands of participants across the country and demonstrating that mass non-violent action was a viable political strategy. Mandela served as the campaign's national volunteer-in-chief, his organizational role placing him at the center of a movement that was, for the first time, meeting the spatial logic of apartheid with a direct physical challenge, bodies in spaces where they were forbidden, the human presence itself as political act. 3 years later, on June 25 and 26, 1955, a gathering of approximately 3,000 delegates assembled on a dusty open field in Kliptown, community south of Johannesburg, to adopt the Freedom Charter, a document that articulated, with remarkable clarity and moral force, the vision of a South Africa that belonged to all who lived in it, regardless of race. The physical setting of the Kliptown gathering was itself a political statement, an open field, accessible to all, transformed briefly into a parliament of the people, a spatial democracy enacted in defiance of a state that organized its spaces around the principle of permanent exclusion. The Freedom Charter's adoption was interrupted by police, who descended on the gathering and confiscated documents. But the Charter itself had already been read aloud and adopted, its words entering the bloodstream of the resistance movement as a permanent articulation of what the struggle was for, not merely what it was against. The treason trial that followed in 1956 brought 156 activists, Mandela among them, into the cold institutional geometry of Pretoria's Palace of Justice. The trial, which dragged across nearly 5 years before ending in acquittal, was the apartheid state's attempt to use the legal system as an instrument of political suppression, to exhaust, impoverish, and demoralize the leadership of the resistance through the machinery of judicial process. The Palace of Justice, with its high ceilings and formal symmetry, its spatial arrangement designed to diminish the accused and magnify the authority of the state, was the physical embodiment of a legal system that claimed the language of justice while serving the purposes of racial domination. Then came Sharpeville. On March 21, 1960, in a township south of Johannesburg, a crowd of several thousand people gathered at the local police station to protest the pass laws, presenting themselves without their passbooks in a deliberate act of non-violent defiance. The police response was catastrophic. Officers opened fire on the crowd, killing 69 people and wounding approximately 180 others. The majority of the dead were shot in the back, evidence that many had been fleeing when they were killed. The environmental aftermath of the massacre, a township road scattered with the physical evidence of state violence, the silence that follows sudden mass death, was a moment of historical rupture whose reverberations would reshape everything that followed. The government's response to Sharpeville was not contrition, but intensification. A state of emergency was declared. The ANC and the Pan-Africanist Congress were banned, their organizational existence made illegal, their leaders subject to arrest and imprisonment. The geography of resistance was forced underground, out of the meeting halls and open fields, into the hidden spaces of a clandestine political life. The iron geography of apartheid had, for the moment, succeeded in making organized opposition invisible. But invisibility, as the years ahead would demonstrate, was not the same as defeat. There is a particular quality of darkness that belongs only to those who have been forced underground, not the darkness of night, which lifts reliably with the turning of the earth, but the sustained, deliberate darkness of a life conducted in concealment, where every ordinary action carries the weight of potential catastrophe, and the landscape itself becomes a map of danger rather than possibility. After Sharpeville, after the banning orders descended, and the ANC was driven from public existence, this was the darkness that settled over South Africa's resistance movement, and it was into this darkness that Nelson Mandela deliberately walked, understanding with clear-eyed precision what it would cost him. The transformation of the resistance landscape, following the ANC's banning in 1960, was total and immediate. The meeting halls, the open fields, the church spaces that had hosted the Defiance campaign and the Freedom Charter gathering, all of these became impossible terrain, monitored by the security branch of the South African police with a thoroughness that made any public organizing an act of immediate self-destruction. The geography of resistance contracted violently, retreating from open public space into a shadowed network of safe houses, private homes, industrial premises, and rural properties, whose ordinary appearances concealed extraordinary purposes. The movement did not disappear. It went underground, and in doing so, it changed its character entirely, becoming something more covert, more disciplined, and ultimately more dangerous to the state that had tried to extinguish it. Mandela's emergence in this period, as the figure the press would eventually call the Black Pimpernel, was a product of both strategic necessity and personal temperament. Moving through Johannesburg and beyond in a succession of disguises, as a chauffeur, as a garden worker, as a chef, he inhabited the city's racial geography in a new way, using the invisibility that apartheid itself had, constructed around black South Africans as a form of operational cover. The system that had designed black workers to be functionally invisible to white authority now provided the camouflage for the man working to dismantle it. He moved through Johannesburg's industrial districts, through the back streets of townships, through the spaces between the city's official geographies, leaving no reliable trace for the security branch officers who were hunting him with increasing urgency. The underground printing operations that sustained the banned movement occupied the unglamorous spaces of Johannesburg's industrial periphery, warehouses and light manufacturing premises whose legitimate commercial activities provided cover for the production of pamphlets, newsletters, and organizational materials that kept the resistance alive in the absence of any legal public presence. These spaces were defined by their deliberate ordinariness. The smell of ink and machine oil, the clatter of duplicating equipment, the stacks of paper that could, at a moment's notice, be concealed beneath legitimate stock. The people who operated them worked with the particular focused calm of those who have accepted that their work carries serious personal risk and have decided to continue regardless. It was in this period that the ANC's leadership made the most consequential strategic decision in the organization's history. After 50 years of non-violent resistance, of petitions, delegations, campaigns, and legal challenges, the movement concluded that the apartheid state's willingness to respond to peaceful protest with lethal force had changed the moral calculus of the struggle. The decision to form Umkhonto, the Sizwe Spear of the Nation, abbreviated as MK, as an armed wing was not taken lightly or unanimously. It represented a fundamental rupture with the philosophical tradition that had guided the ANC since its founding, and it was accompanied by careful strategic thinking about the specific forms of violence that would be employed. MK's initial strategy was explicitly directed at economic and infrastructure sabotage. The targeting of power installations, railway lines, and government facilities rather than human beings. The distinction was morally and strategically significant. The movement was signaling its willingness to escalate while simultaneously attempting to limit civilian casualties and preserve the possibility of a future negotiated settlement. Mandela was a founding member of MK's High Command, and the organization's early operational planning was conducted in the spaces of Johannesburg's underground geography. But the most significant of these spaces was located not in the city itself, but on its northern periphery, in the suburb of Rivonia. The Lillisleaf farm was, in its outward appearance, an entirely unremarkable agricultural property. A working smallholding with a red-roofed farmhouse, outbuildings, cultivated fields, and the general atmosphere of rural domesticity that made it invisible to casual observation. Mandela lived there for a period under the cover identity of David Motsame, a farm worker, moving through the property's daily rhythms, while the farmhouse and its outbuildings served as the operational headquarters of the ANC's underground command. The contrast between the farm's pastoral surface and its revolutionary interior was the defining spatial irony of this period. A revolution being planned in the language of agricultural routine, the most ordinary landscape imaginable concealing the most extraordinary purpose. In January 1962, Mandela left South Africa covertly, crossing the border into the broader African continent on a journey that would take him through newly independent nations whose physical environments offered a profound visual counterpoint to the apartheid republic he had left behind. The Pan-African landscape of the early 1960s was a geography of possibility, of flags being raised over government buildings that had recently housed colonial administrations, of borders that could be crossed without the elaborate documentation that controlled black South African movement, of public spaces that did not announce, in cold bureaucratic signage, the racial category of those permitted to use them. In Ethiopia, Mandela underwent a period of military training, learning the physical disciplines of armed resistance in a landscape whose ancient mountains and open plains bore no resemblance to the industrial geography of the Witwatersrand. The experience of moving through Africa as a free man, without the constant surveillance and spatial restriction of apartheid's geography, was itself a form of political education, a visceral demonstration of what the struggle was ultimately for. His return to South Africa in July 1962 brought him back into the constrained geography of the underground, but the period of operational freedom was brief. On August 5, 1962, on a rural road in KwaZulu-Natal near Howick, the car in which Mandela was traveling was stopped by police. The arrest was the product of a tip. The security branch had been informed of his movements, and the open road that had represented freedom suddenly became a trap, the landscape closing around him with the finality of a door being shut. He was taken into custody, charged initially with incitement and leaving the country without a passport, and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. The open horizons of the Transkei, the Pan-African skies he had traveled beneath, all of it contracted, in that moment on a KwaZulu-Natal road, to the dimensions of a police vehicle and the cold certainty of imprisonment. But the more consequential legal drama was still to come. In July 1963, security branch officers raided Lillisleaf Farm in Rivonia, arresting the ANC's underground leadership and seizing documents that detailed MK's operational planning and organizational structure. The documents recovered at Lillisleaf were devastating in their specificity. They provided the prosecution with evidence of a conspiracy that the state would characterize as high treason, a charge carrying the death penalty. Mandela, already imprisoned, was brought from his cell to face the new charges alongside his colleagues. The Rivonia trial, which opened in October 1963 at the Palace of Justice in Pretoria, was the apartheid state's attempt to decapitate the resistance movement through judicial process, to use the formal machinery of law to eliminate the men who had organized against it. The Palace of Justice was a building designed to communicate the authority and permanence of the state. Its high ceilings and institutional lighting, its formal spatial arrangement with the accused placed physically below and before the elevated bench of the judiciary, its cold symmetry. All of these architectural elements serve to diminish those brought before it and to magnify the power of those who sat in judgment. The accused in the Rivonia trial, Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, Ahmed Kathrada, and others, occupied this space with a dignity that the architecture had not been designed to accommodate. They refused the diminishment the courtroom's spatial logic intended, conducting themselves with a composure that communicated to those watching from the public gallery and to the international observers whose presence the case had attracted, that these were not men who accepted the state's characterization of their actions as criminal. The international attention focused on the Rivonia trial was itself a form of spatial expansion. The cold, institutional interior of the Pretoria courtroom connected, through the work of journalists and diplomats and solidarity organizations, to the broader geography of global conscience. The United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution by 106 votes to 1, only South Africa voting against, calling for the end of the trial and the release of the prisoners. The anti-apartheid movement in Britain organized protests and campaigns that brought the trial's significance into the streets of London and the chambers of Parliament. The Secretary-General of the United Nations wrote directly to the South African government, warning that execution of the Rivonia trialists would make it impossible for the international community to resist pressure for comprehensive economic sanctions. On April 20, 1964, Mandela rose in the dock of the Palace of Justice and delivered a statement that would become one of the defining documents of the 20th century's struggle for human dignity. He spoke for several hours, tracing with methodical clarity the history of apartheid's injustices, the ANC's long commitment to non-violent resistance, and the reasoning that had led the movement to the decision to take up sabotage as a last resort. He concluded with words that fell into the institutional silence of the courtroom with the weight of absolute conviction, that the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons would live together in harmony and with equal opportunities was an ideal for which he was prepared to live, and if necessary, an ideal for which he was prepared to die. The judge, by multiple accounts, was visibly shaken. The public gallery was silent with the particular silence that follows words that cannot be unsaid. The verdict, delivered on June 11, 1964, found Mandela and 7 co-accused guilty on all counts of sabotage. The sentence, announced the following day, was life imprisonment. The death penalty, which the prosecution had sought, and which the evidence technically supported under South African law, was not imposed, a decision influenced, at least in part, by the weight of international pressure that had accumulated around the case. The relief that greeted the life sentence, rather than the death sentence, was itself a measure of how completely the trial had come to represent something larger than its immediate legal proceedings. 4. The resistance movement operating underground within South Africa, for the Excel community, for the solidarity organizations working across the world, the life sentence was not a victory, but a stay, a continuation of the struggle under conditions of extreme adversity rather than its termination. The men convicted at Rivonia were taken from the Palace of Justice and transporting to Robben Island, where the cold waters of Table Bay and the engineered desolation of a maximum security prison awaited them. The earth had gone dark. The long waiting had begun. 7 miles. That was the precise, cruel distance between Robben Island and the Cape Town shoreline, close enough, on clear days, that prisoners standing in the exercise yard could make out the silhouette of Table Mountain rising above the city, its flat summit catching the afternoon light with a clarity that made the distance feel simultaneously intimate and absolute. 7 miles of cold Atlantic water, churned by the Benguela current into swells that crashed against the island's granite shoreline with a force that had been building across thousands of miles of open ocean. 7 miles that might as well have been the distance between one world and another, between the living geography of ordinary human existence and the engineered desolation of a place designed, with considerable deliberate care, to break the men confined within it. The island itself is a flat, wind-scoured outcrop of approximately 5 square kilometers, its highest point barely 30 meters above sea level. Its exposure to the prevailing southwesterly winds so complete that the vegetation has been permanently shaped by the force of air moving across it. The sparse scrub and coastal fynbos bent uniformly in the direction of the prevailing blow, as though the landscape itself has learned to lean away from the wind's insistence. The Atlantic waters surrounding the island are cold even in summer, the Benguela current drawing deep, frigid water up from the ocean floor and spreading it across the surface of Table Bay with a consistency that makes swimming to the mainland not merely difficult, but effectively impossible. The island's rocky shoreline offers no gentle beaches, no gradual approach to the water, only granite shelves and boulders against which the swells shatter in explosions of white water that can be heard from the prison buildings on calm days. This was the environment to which Nelson Mandela and his Rivonia trial co-accused were transporting in June 1964, arriving by ferry from Cape Town Harbour in the grey morning light that characterises the Cape winter. The ferry crossing itself was a spatial transition of profound symbolic weight, the mainland receding behind, the island growing ahead, the cold water between them making the separation from the world of ordinary human movement physically, viscerally real in a way that no courtroom verdict could quite accomplish. The men who had stood in the palace of justice and spoken of democracy and dignity now stood on the deck of a prison ferry, watching the last geography of freedom disappear into the morning mist. The prison that received them was a study in spatial control, a complex of whitewashed buildings whose institutional geometry communicated, in the language of architecture, the absolute authority of those who had designed it over those who would inhabit it. The walls were high and featureless, their surfaces reflecting the harsh Cape light with a blankness that offered nothing for the eye to rest upon. The corridors were narrow, their identical green doors repeating with a monotony that was itself a form of psychological pressure. The visual grammar of a space designed to eliminate individual distinction and replace it with the undifferentiated identity of the prisoner. B section, where the political prisoners were housed, was a maximum security area within the maximum security facility, a further constriction within an already constricted world. Mandela's cell in B section measured approximately 8 feet by 7 feet. Within this space, smaller than most domestic bathrooms, he would spend the majority of his waking and sleeping hours for 18 of his 27 years of imprisonment. The cell contained a sleeping mat, later replaced by a bed, a small table, and a bucket that served as a toilet. A single window, set high in the wall and too elevated for a standing man to see through without effort, admitted a rectangle of sky that changed with the seasons. The pale, washed blue of Cape winter, the deep saturated blue of summer, the dramatic cloud formations that built over the mountain and rolled across the bay. This rectangle of sky became, over the years, the cell's primary connection to the world beyond its walls, a frame through which the passage of time could be read in the changing quality of light, the angle of sun, the presence or absence of stars on the rare nights when the window's position permitted a glimpse of them. The limestone quarry where prisoners were required to labor occupied a site on the island's interior, its white walls rising from the surrounding scrub with a starkness that was visible from considerable distance. The work assigned to political prisoners was the extraction of limestone by hand, the breaking and shifting of rock with picks and shovels under the supervision of warders, whose relationship to the men in their charge ranged from indifferent to actively hostile. The physical conditions of quarry labor were brutal in ways that accumulated slowly, but with devastating cumulative effect. The limestone surface under the summer sun reflected light with an intensity that was, quite literally, blinding, the glare bouncing off the white rock face, and the quarry floor with a force that caused chronic eye damage to the men who worked there for years without adequate protection. Mandela, along with many of his fellow prisoners, suffered lasting damage to his eyesight as a direct consequence of years of exposure to the quarry's reflected glare. A physical mark that the island left on his body, and that remained with him for the rest of his life. But the quarry was also, paradoxically, a space of resistance and community. The physical proximity enforced by the work, men laboring together in the confined space of the quarry floor, created conditions for conversation that the cell blocks did not permit. The quarry became, over the years, an informal university, a space where the prisoners educated one another, debating history, philosophy, law, and political strategy in the intervals between the demands of the work itself. Mandela, whose legal training and political experience made him a natural teacher, participated in these discussions with an intensity that transformed the degrading labor of stone breaking into something the prison authorities had not intended, an ongoing seminar in the ideas and strategies of liberation. The quarry's walls, carved lower year by year by the labor of the men imprisoned within them, became an inadvertent monument to the passage of time and the persistence of human purpose in conditions designed to extinguish it. The passage of years on Robben Island was marked by changes so gradual that they could only be perceived in retrospect. The slow erosion of the quarry walls, the subtle shifts in the quality of light through the cell window across seasons and decades, the accumulation of small humanizing details in an otherwise dehumanizing space. Letters were among the most significant of these details, the carefully rationed correspondence that connected the prisoners to the world beyond the island's shores. In the early years of imprisonment, Mandela was permitted to send and receive one letter every 6 months, each letter subject to censorship that could reduce it to a few legible lines surrounded by the black marks of the censor's pen. These letters, their physical presence, the handwriting of family members, the news they carried of children growing and parents aging, and a world continuing without him, were luminous objects in the grey institutional palette of prison life, their emotional warmth standing in stark contrast to the cold surfaces of the cell that contained them. A small garden, cultivated in whatever space the prison authorities permitted, became another such anchor. Mandela's interest in growing things, in the patient, long-term work of tending plants through seasons of growth and dormancy, was both a practical activity and a profound metaphor. The garden required exactly the qualities that imprisonment demanded: patience, attention to slow processes, faith that effort invested today would produce results visible only in a future that could not be precisely anticipated. The small plots of vegetables and flowers that Mandela managed to cultivate in the prison's limited spaces were, in their modest way, acts of insistence, assertions that life and growth were possible even in a place designed to deny them. The documentary record of Robben Island's significance has been substantially enriched by first-hand accounts from those who survived it. Eddie Daniels, among others, provided testimony about the daily reality of prison life, the petty humiliations deliberately inflicted by the prison administration, the solidarity that developed among the prisoners in response, the strategies of psychological resistance that allowed men to maintain their dignity and their purpose across decades of confinement. These accounts reveal an institution that was not merely a place of physical imprisonment, but a sustained assault on the humanity and the political identity of those confined within it, and a community of prisoners who responded to that assault with a collective resilience that ultimately defeated its purpose. The political landscape outside the island's walls was changing throughout the years of Mandela's imprisonment, and the changes registered within the prison in subtle but perceptible ways. The Soweto uprising of 1976, the intensifying international pressure of the late 1970s and 1980s, the growing economic cost of apartheid's isolation. All of these developments altered the conditions of imprisonment in ways that reflected the shifting balance of power between the apartheid state and the forces arrayed against it. The authorities' treatment of the political prisoners, while never humane, became gradually less overtly brutal as the state's confidence in its own permanence began to erode. In 1982, After 18 years in B section, Mandela was transferred to Portsmouth Prison on the mainland, in the southern suburbs of Cape Town. The environmental shift was significant, from the island's isolation to the urban periphery, from the narrow cell to a larger communal space shared with several co-accused. Portsmouth's environment was less dramatically desolate than Robben Island's. Its surroundings the ordinary suburban landscape of the Cape Peninsula, rather than the wind-scoured isolation of the island. But it remained a prison, its walls as absolute in their confinement as the Atlantic waters had been, its institutional palette of grey and green as cold as the limestone quarries' reflected light. The final stage of Mandela's imprisonment brought him to Victor Verster Prison, near Paarl in the Cape Winelands, in December 1988. The environment here was different again, a small house within the prison grounds, set among the vineyards and oak trees of the Bowland landscape, its relative comfort a reflection of the changed political reality that now surrounded the question of Mandela's imprisonment. The apartheid state, under increasing pressure from within and without, had begun the process of negotiating the terms of his release, and the comfortable house at Victor Verster was both a practical arrangement and a signal, an acknowledgement that the man who had been sent to Robben Island as a criminal was now being treated, however quietly, as a political interlocutor whose cooperation would be necessary for whatever came next. The cold, desaturated palette of the prison years, the grey of institutional walls, the white of limestone, the green of identical cell doors, had not yet given way to the full spectrum of liberation. But in the vineyards visible from the house at Victor Verster, in the oak trees that filtered the Bowland light into something warmer and more complex than the quarry's blinding glare, there were the first intimations of a colour returning to the world. The island at the edge of the world had done its worst and failed in its essential purpose. The man it had tried to break had instead been deepened, his patience extended across decades, his understanding of human nature enriched by the full range of what confinement reveals, his capacity for forgiveness tested and confirmed by the extraordinary crucible of 27 years. Robben Island had become, against every intention of those who built it, not a monument to the power of the apartheid state, but to the limits of that power, and to the extraordinary, irreducible resilience of the human spirit it had tried and failed to extinguish. While a man sat in a cell measuring 8 feet by 7 feet, and while the limestone quarry of Robben Island continued its slow excavation under the southern sun, the world beyond the island's granite shores was not standing still. It was organizing, marching, legislating, and burning, building, across continents and decades, a pressure that would eventually become irresistible. The story of Mandela's imprisonment is inseparable from the story of what happened in his absence, in the cities and parliaments and township streets where the struggle continued without him. London received the anti-apartheid cause with the particular grey determination of a city that has always understood the relationship between empire and injustice. Outside South Africa House on Trafalgar Square, a building whose Georgian facade looked out over one of the world's most photographed public spaces, protesters gathered with a regularity that became, over the years, a permanent feature of the city's political landscape. The marches moved through the drizzle of English winters and the rare warmth of English summers, their banners catching the wind above the square's fountains, their chants absorbed into the ambient noise of a city that had learned to accommodate dissent as a form of civic weather. The anti-apartheid movement, founded in London in 1959, operated from modest offices in the city's northern neighbourhoods, Islington and Notting Hill terraced houses, where ANC representatives in exile maintained the organisational infrastructure of a banned movement. Their filing cabinets and duplicating machines and international correspondence constituting a shadow government of resistance conducted from rented rooms in a foreign city. Oliver Tambo, who had left South Africa in 1960 to lead the ANC's external mission, became the human embodiment of this exile geography. A man who spent 30 years moving between the capitals of sympathetic nations, building the international coalition that would eventually make apartheid's continuation economically and diplomatically untenable. His presence in London, Stockholm, Lusaka, and New York transformed the ANC's cause from a local African political struggle into a matter of global moral concern, connecting the specific injustices of South African racial law to the broader international conversation about human rights and self-determination that had been reshaping the post-war world order. Scandinavia offered a different quality of solidarity, cooler in its light, more systematic in its approach, but no less committed in its substance. The government buildings of Stockholm and Oslo, rendered in the pale northern light that gives Scandinavian cities their particular quality of civic seriousness, became sites of diplomatic pressure whose consequences were measurable in the economic isolation that gradually tightened around the apartheid state. Sweden, under Prime Minister Olof Palme, provided direct financial support to the ANC that sustained its operational capacity through decades of exile. A governmental commitment to the anti-apartheid cause that went considerably beyond the symbolic gestures that characterized the response of many Western nations. The Nordic countries' willingness to treat the ANC as a legitimate government in waiting, rather than as a terrorist organization as the apartheid state, and some of its Western allies characterized it, was a form of diplomatic recognition that carried real strategic weight. The United Nations, housed in its distinctive mid-century tower above the East River in New York, became the arena for the formal international condemnation of apartheid that accumulated resolution by resolution across the decades of Mandela's imprisonment. The great glass building's chambers, designed to accommodate the voices of the world's nations in a single architectural space, heard repeated calls for sanctions, for the release of political prisoners, for the international community to treat apartheid not as a domestic South African matter, but as a crime against humanity that implicated every nation that maintained economic or diplomatic relations with Pretoria. The Special Committee Against Apartheid, established by the General Assembly in 1962, maintained continuous international attention on the situation within South Africa, ensuring that the apartheid state could not conduct its operations in the comfortable obscurity that might otherwise have attended a small nation's domestic arrangements. The economic dimension of this international pressure was the mechanism through which moral condemnation was translated into material consequence. The divestment movement that gathered force through the 1970s and 1980s. On university campuses across the United States and Europe, in the boardrooms of multinational corporations, in the investment committees of pension funds and institutional investors, represented a systematic attempt to make apartheid expensive for those who profited from it. The physical geography of this campaign was the geography of global capital. The trading floors of New York and London, the shareholder meetings of corporations with South African operations, the legislative chambers where sanctions legislation was debated, and eventually, in the case of the United States Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986, passed over a presidential veto. Within South Africa itself, the world beyond Robben Island's walls was undergoing transformations of its own, transformations that the imprisoned leadership could follow only through the filtered, censored channels of prison correspondence and the occasional newspaper that made its way into the cell blocks. The Soweto uprising of June 16, 1976 was the most seismic of these internal convulsions, a student revolt that began as a protest against the apartheid government's requirement that black schools conduct instruction in Afrikaans, a language the students experience not as a neutral medium of education, but as the language of their oppressors, imposed upon them as a final indignity in an educational system already designed to limit their possibilities. The streets of Soweto on June 16, 1976, and in the weeks that followed, were transformed into a landscape of confrontation. Tear gas drifting across residential streets, burning barricades constructed from whatever materials the township's residents could assemble, the distinctive silhouettes of armored police vehicles moving through neighborhoods that had never been designed to accommodate military hardware. The government's response to the uprising was, as at Sharpeville 16 years earlier, the application of lethal force, hundreds of young people killed in the weeks of unrest that followed the initial confrontation. But the uprising could not be suppressed into silence in the way that earlier resistance had been. The images of Soweto's burning streets traveled across the world through the international media, arriving in the living rooms of people in London and Stockholm and New York, and generating a wave of moral revulsion that strengthened the hand of those arguing for comprehensive international sanctions. The generation of activists formed in the crucible of the Soweto uprising became the internal resistance movement of the 1980s. Young men and women who had grown up entirely within the apartheid system and who brought to their resistance a fury and an urgency that complemented the more measured strategic approach of the older ANC generation. The United Democratic Front, established in 1983 as an internal coalition of anti-apartheid organizations, gave organizational form to this energy, creating a structure that could coordinate resistance across the country without the formal organizational infrastructure that the ANC's banned status made impossible. The UDF's geography was the geography of community organizing. Church halls where meetings were conducted under the nominal cover of religious gatherings. Sports fields where young people assembled in numbers too large for the security apparatus to monitor effectively. Schoolyards where the next generation of activists received an education in resistance alongside their official curriculum. The 1980s within South Africa were a decade of intensifying environmental crisis, a landscape visibly straining under the weight of a system that was simultaneously trying to maintain comprehensive racial control and manage the economic and political consequences of its own contradictions. The states of emergency declared by the government in 1985 and 1986 transformed the townships into occupied territories in the most literal sense. Army vehicles on residential streets, soldiers conducting house-to-house searches, curfews that made the simple act of moving through one's own neighborhood after dark an act of potential criminality. The physical infrastructure of apartheid, the checkpoints, the permit offices, the pass law enforcement machinery, was being deployed at maximum intensity precisely at the moment when the system's internal contradictions were making that intensity unsustainable. The international community's response to the states of emergency was the comprehensive sanctions that the apartheid government had spent decades attempting to prevent. The Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act passed by the United States Congress in 1986, the European Community's sanctions measures, the Commonwealth's Gleneagles Agreement restricting sporting contacts. These were the formal legislative expressions of a moral consensus that had been building across decades of patient organizing by the Excel community, the solidarity movements, and the internal resistance. The economic consequences were real and cumulative. The Rand's collapse, the withdrawal of foreign investment, the debt crisis that followed the refusal of international banks to roll over South African loans in 1985. All of these developments were registered in the physical landscape of South Africa as a system beginning to show the structural cracks that precede collapse. The world beyond the walls had done its work across 3 decades, in the grey drizzle of London's protest marches, in the cool deliberation of Scandinavian government chambers, in the glass tower above the East River, in the burning streets of Soweto, in the church halls and sports fields, where the United Democratic Front built its geography of resistance. The pressure had accumulated, resolution by resolution, sanction by sanction, march by march, until the walls themselves had begun, almost imperceptibly, to tremble. Inside Victor Verster prison, in the relative comfort of a house among Cape Winelands vineyards, a man who had spent 27 years at the center of this global struggle was beginning, through carefully managed and initially secret conversations with the apartheid government, to negotiate the terms of a transformation that the world beyond the walls had made inevitable. There are moments in history when a single room becomes the hinge upon which an entire world turns, when words spoken within 4 walls alter the geography of a nation so completely that the landscape outside those walls will never again be arranged in quite the same way. On February 2, 1990, the chamber of the South African Parliament in Cape Town was such a room, and the words spoken within it by State President F.W. de Klerk were such words. The Parliament building itself is a structure of considerable colonial grandeur, a Victorian-era complex of pale stone set in formal gardens at the foot of Table Mountain, its architecture communicating the weight and permanence of the order it was built to house. The chamber where de Klerk rose to address the assembled members was a space of high ceilings and formal arrangement, its spatial grammar designed to project authority and continuity. The continuity of a system that had organized South African political life around the absolute exclusion of the majority of its population. On the morning of February 2, that spatial grammar was about to be permanently disrupted. De Klerk's announcement was comprehensive in its scope and stunning in its implications. The African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the South African Communist Party, and 31 other organizations were to be unbanned. Political prisoners were to be released. The state of emergency provisions that had transformed the townships into occupied territories were to be lifted. And Nelson Mandela, imprisoned for 27 years, was to be released unconditionally. The chamber received these words in a silence that was itself a form of historical testimony. The silence of a room in which everyone present understood, with varying degrees of relief and dread, that the world they had known was ending. 9 days later, on the afternoon of February 11, 1990, the gates of Victor Verster prison opened onto a road crowded with people, and Nelson Mandela walked through them into the light of a South African summer afternoon. The moment was one of the most photographed in the history of the 20th century. A man of 71 years, his right fist raised, Winnie Mandela beside him, the crowd pressing forward with an energy that was simultaneously celebratory and overwhelmed, as though the accumulated emotion of 27 years was attempting to express itself in a single instant. The sky above the prison gates was wide and blue, the Cape summer light falling on the scene with a clarity that the documentary's visual palette renders in full saturated color. The first moment in the prison, narrative where the cold, desaturated greys and blues of confinement give way to the complete spectrum of the world outside. The physical expansion of that moment, the prison gates opening, the road stretching ahead, the crowd filling the landscape in every direction, was the visual grammar of liberation made literal. After 27 years in which the horizon had been defined by cell walls, quarry faces, and the cold Atlantic waters surrounding Robben Island, the landscape was suddenly, overwhelmingly open. The crowds that lined the road from Victor Verster to Cape Town, the tens of thousands who gathered at the grand parade in the city centre to hear Mandela speak for the first time as a free man, the millions watching on television screens across the world. All of them were participants in a moment of environmental transformation, as profound as any physical change the landscape had undergone. Mandela's first public address as a free man was delivered from the balcony of Cape Town City Hall, a building whose colonial facade looked out over the Grand Parade, a public square that had been, for centuries, a site of commerce and public assembly in the shadow of Table Mountain. The mountain itself, its flat summit catching the late afternoon light, provided the backdrop for a speech that reaffirmed the ANC's commitment to negotiation, while making clear that the struggle was not over, that the release of one man, however symbolically significant, was not the same as the liberation of a people. The landscape of Cape Town, with its extraordinary natural setting and its deeply scarred social geography, was the appropriate stage for this declaration. A city of extraordinary beauty, built on a foundation of extraordinary injustice, its future still to be determined. The geography of the negotiations that followed Mandela's release was a deliberate exercise in spatial neutrality, an attempt to find environments that belonged, as far as possible, to neither the old South Africa nor the new, where the representatives of the apartheid government and the liberation movement could occupy the same room without either party being required to enter the other's territory. The World Trade Center in Kempton Park, east of Johannesburg, a modern, functional conference facility whose architecture was entirely without historical resonance or symbolic weight, became the primary site of the convention for a democratic South Africa, known as CODESA, which began its formal sessions in December 1991. The World Trade Center's interior was a landscape of negotiating tables, simultaneous translation equipment, and the particular atmosphere of concentrated political will that characterizes moments when the future is being actively constructed. The delegations that faced each other across those tables represented the full spectrum of South African political life. The National Party government, the ANC, the Inkatha Freedom Party, the Pan-Africanist Congress, and numerous smaller parties and homeland administrations, each bringing to the negotiations its own history, its own constituency, and its own vision of what a post-apartheid South Africa should look like. The process was neither smooth nor inevitable. It was fractious, frequently deadlocked, and punctuated by crises that threatened at multiple points to derail it entirely. The violence that accompanied the negotiation period was one of the most painful dimensions of this transitional landscape. The townships of the Witwatersrand and KwaZulu-Natal became, through the late 1980s and early 1990s, sites of brutal conflict between ANC-aligned and Inkatha Freedom Party-aligned communities. A conflict that bore the marks of deliberate instigation by elements within the security apparatus of the apartheid state, a strategy of destabilization designed to demonstrate that black South Africans were incapable of peaceful self-governance. The physical environments of this violence were the streets and hostels of townships whose names, Volpatong, Bisho, the East Rand, became associated with specific atrocities that tested the negotiation process's capacity to survive the weight of ongoing bloodshed. Then came the morning of April 10, 1993, and the quiet suburban geography of Boksburg. Chris Hani, the leader of the South African Communist Party and one of the most beloved figures in the liberation movement, was shot dead in the driveway of his home on a Saturday morning, killed by a right-wing Polish immigrant acting in concert with a Conservative Party politician. The neighborhood where it happened was an ordinary South African suburb, the kind of residential landscape of modest houses and garden walls that existed in thousands of variations across the country, its ordinariness making the violence that erupted within it all the more shocking. Hani's assassination sent a convulsion through South African society that threatened to collapse the entire negotiation process under the weight of grief and rage. The response to Hani's murder became, paradoxically, one of the defining demonstrations of Mandela's leadership in the transitional period. Appearing on national television, a medium whose reach across the country's fractured geography made it the closest thing available to a genuinely national public space, Mandela addressed the nation with a composure and a moral authority that the moment required, and that he alone, among South Africa's political figures, possessed in sufficient measure to provide. His appeal for calm, for the continuation of the negotiation process as the appropriate response to the assassination, was heard across the country's townships and suburbs and rural areas, and it held. The violence that many had feared would follow Hani's murder did not materialize at the scale that might have ended the transition. The negotiations resumed. The process continued. The agreement on a date for South Africa's first democratic election, April 27, 1994, was itself a transformation of the country's temporal geography, a fixed point in the future around which the entire political landscape began to reorganize itself. The months between the agreement and the election were months of extraordinary intensity, of voter registration campaigns conducted across a country whose black majority had never been permitted to vote, of political rallies that drew hundreds of thousands of people to open spaces in cities and townships and rural areas, of the practical logistics of organizing an election in a country where the infrastructure of democratic participation had never existed for the majority of the population. The physical act of voting, when it finally arrived on April 27, 1994, produced one of the most extraordinary visual landscapes in the history of democratic politics. Across South Africa, in the townships of Soweto and Alexandra, in the rural villages of the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, in the suburban polling stations of Cape Town and Pretoria, on the dirt roads of the former homelands, lines of voters formed in the pre-dawn darkness and stretched for hours into the morning light. The queues were themselves a landscape of equality made visible. People who had been separated by apartheid's spatial logic standing together in the same line, waiting for the same thing, participating in the same act of democratic self-determination for the first time in their lives, and in the lives of their parents and grandparents before them. The documentary renders this landscape with the full saturated palette that the moment demands, the colors of the voters' clothing against the ochre dust of township streets, the blue of polling station tense against the sky, the green of rural hillsides where lines of people wound along paths between villages. The visual motif of the open horizon, established in the documentary's earliest sequences as the environmental grammar of freedom, returns here with its full accumulated symbolic weight. The wide skies above the polling stations echoing the wide skies above the hills of Quinu, the landscape of possibility restored after decades of enforced constriction. Mandela himself voted at Olange High School in Inanda, KwaZulu-Natal, a location chosen with deliberate historical significance, for it was there that John Dube, the first president of the ANC, was buried. The act of casting his ballot at the grave of the organization's founder connected the moment of democratic arrival to the century-long arc of the struggle that had produced it, a spatial and temporal gesture that only a man of Mandela's historical consciousness would have thought to make. He was 75 years old. He had waited 50 years for this moment, and 27 of those years had been spent in a cell whose dimensions he could cross in 4 steps. The results of the election, announced over several days, as the counting proceeded across the country's 9 new provinces, confirmed what the queues at the polling stations had already made visually apparent. The ANC had won a decisive majority, with approximately 62% of the national vote. Nelson Mandela would become South Africa's first democratically elected president. The inauguration ceremony, held at the Union Buildings in Pretoria on May 10, 1994, was a moment of such concentrated historical significance that the landscape itself seemed to strain under its weight. The Union Buildings, a Herbert Baker masterpiece of sandstone terraces and twin-domed towers set on the Manchester Ridge above Pretoria, designed in the early 20th century as the administrative headquarters of the Union of South Africa, had been, for the entirety of their existence, a monument to white political power. The building's terraced gardens, descending in formal geometric precision from the building's facade to the city below, had hosted the ceremonies of a state from which the majority of the country's population had been excluded by law and by violence. On May 10, 1994, those gardens were transformed. The terraces were filled with an audience of thousands, diplomats and heads of state from across the world, representatives of the liberation movement and the old government standing in proximity that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. Ordinary South Africans who had traveled from across the country to witness the moment. The South African Air Force performed a flypast in the new national colors. Military units that had, within living memory, been instruments of apartheid's enforcement presented arms in honor of the man they had once been deployed to suppress. The full saturated sunlight of a Pretoria autumn morning fell on the Union Buildings with a warmth that the documentary's visual palette renders as the culmination of everything that has come before. The cold blues of imprisonment, the desaturated greys of institutional confinement, the high-contrast urban palette of the activist years, all of it resolved at last into the complete, luminous spectrum of a world restored to its full range of color and possibility. The lens flare that the documentary reserves for moments of genuine historical transcendence catches the light above the Union Building's twin towers, spreading across the frame with the particular quality of light that belongs to moments when history pivots and the world becomes, briefly, legible as something other than a record of suffering. Mandela's inauguration address spoke of the extraordinary human disaster that apartheid had represented, and of the birth of a new society committed to the liberation of all its people from the continuing bondage of poverty, deprivation, suffering, gender, and other discrimination. The words fell across the terraced gardens, and across the city below, and across the country beyond, carried by radio and television into the townships and the rural villages and the suburban homes where South Africans of every background were listening, understanding that whatever came next, whatever difficulties and disappointments the future held, this moment was real and irreversible. The long walk had ended. The horizon that had been visible from the hills of Quinu, that had been glimpsed through a rectangle of sky above a prison cell, that had been carried across 27 years of confinement as an article of faith rather than a certainty, that horizon had been reached. South Africa had arrived at the beginning of itself. The red earth of the Eastern Cape does not change. Decades pass, governments rise and fall, the names of streets are altered, and statues are raised and occasionally toppled. But the ancient hills of the Transkei roll on in their ochre continuity, indifferent to the particular dramas of human history, while absorbing them, generation by generation, into the patient permanence of the land itself. It is to this earth, the same earth that received the first footsteps of a curious boy named Rolihlahla, that Nelson Mandela was returned in December 2013, the landscape of his origins, becoming, at last, the landscape of his rest. He had come back to Quinu years before his death, returning to the village of his childhood in his retirement with the deliberateness of a man who understood that the places that form us are also the places that complete us. The homestead he built there was modest by the standards of a former head of state, a collection of buildings arranged on a hillside above the valley, its design echoing the layout of the great place at Mkuhekisweni, where his childhood had been transformed by the experience of governance and ceremony. The red clay paths between the buildings, the views across the rolling hills to the horizon, the sounds of cattle, and the smell of the cooking fires that still burned at dusk in the village below. All of these were continuities with the world that had first shaped him, environmental constants that had persisted through everything the century had demanded of the man who had grown up among them. On December 5, 2013, at the age of 95, Mandela died at his home in Johannesburg. The state funeral that followed, conducted over 10 days of national mourning that drew heads of state and ordinary citizens from across the world, concluded on December 15 with his burial at Quinu. The red earth of the Eastern Cape received him back with the quiet authority that landscapes exercise over the human lives that pass through them. The same soil that had stained his childhood feet, the same hills that had defined his earliest understanding of what it meant to be alive and free, closing over the physical remains of a life that had altered the course of history while remaining, in some essential way, rooted in the particular geography of its origins. The grave site at Quinu is now a place of pilgrimage, visited by South Africans and international travelers who make the journey to the Eastern Cape not merely to pay respects to a historical figure, but to stand in the landscape that produced him, to feel the quality of the light and the texture of the red earth and the scale of the open sky, and to understand, in the most immediate sensory terms, what kind of world it was that shaped the character that would eventually shape a nation. The documentary's visual palette returns here to its opening register, the deep ochres and savanna greens, the golden hour light casting long shadows across the hills, the wide sky above the Transkei horizon unchanged by everything that has passed beneath it. 7 miles from Cape Town's shore, the island that tried to break him has become something its architects could never have intended. Robben Island was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1999, its designation recognizing the prison not as a monument to the power of the apartheid state, but as a testament to the resilience of those who survived it. and to the global significance of the struggle for human dignity that was conducted within its walls. The prison corridors that once echoed with the sounds of institutional control now carry the footsteps of visitors from every nation on Earth, guided through the narrow passages and identical green doors by former political prisoners who have transformed their own experience of confinement into a form of historical testimony. The limestone quarry, where Mandela and his colleagues labored for years under the blinding reflected glare of the Cape summer sun, has been preserved as a monument, its white walls standing as they were left when the prisoners were finally released, the accumulated excavation of decades of forced labor visible in the depth of the quarry floor below the surrounding landscape. Visitors stand at the quarry's edge and look down into the space where men broke stone with hand tools while conducting, in the intervals between the demands of the work, an informal university of liberation. A cairn of stones marks the spot where, in a gesture of solidarity and remembrance, former prisoners and subsequent visitors have added individual stones to a growing pile. Each stone, a small physical act of connection to the history that the quarry contains. The cell in B section, where Mandela spent 18 years, its dimensions unchanged, its single high window still admitting the same rectangle of Cape sky, is perhaps the most visited room in South Africa. The sleeping mat, the small table, the bucket, the objects of a deliberately impoverished existence, are preserved exactly as they were, the institutional spareness of the space communicating, to those who stand within it, something that no amount of narration can fully convey. The physical experience of the cell's dimensions, the ability to cross it in 4 steps, to reach both walls simultaneously with outstretched arms, is a form of historical knowledge that enters the body rather than the intellect, producing in visitors a visceral understanding of what 27 years in such a space would require of a human being. Back on the mainland, the apartheid museum in Johannesburg stands as perhaps the most architecturally sophisticated memorial to the system that Mandela's life was dedicated to dismantling. Opened in 2001, the museum was designed by a team of South African architects with a deliberate intention to make the experience of racial classification physically legible to its visitors. At the entrance, visitors are randomly assigned one of 2 classifications, white or non-white, and directed through separate entrance tunnels whose different qualities of space and light communicate, in the language of architecture rather than text, something of what it meant to inhabit a world organized around racial hierarchy. The tunnels converge inside the museum, the separation dissolving into a shared space of historical encounter, a spatial metaphor for the post-apartheid project of building a common national identity from the divided materials of the apartheid past. The museum's interior moves through the history of apartheid and the resistance to it with a combination of archival material, environmental installation, and spatial design that creates an experience simultaneously intellectual and emotional. The past books displayed in their thousands, the actual documents that controlled the movement of millions of black South Africans through their own country, accumulate in their sheer quantity into something beyond historical artifact, becoming a physical measure of the bureaucratic thoroughness with which the apartheid state organized the diminishment of human dignity. The footage of the Sharpeville massacre, the Soweto uprising, the states of emergency, projected in the museum's darkened screening spaces, carries the weight of documented historical reality rather than the distancing effect of mere illustration. Constitution Hill, located in the Braamfontein neighborhood of Johannesburg, represents perhaps the most architecturally complex integration of apartheid history and post-apartheid aspiration in South Africa. The site was, for most of the 20th century, a prison complex, the Old Fort, which housed white prisoners, and number 4, the section reserved for black prisoners, where Mandela himself was held on several occasions before his imprisonment on Robben Island. The Constitutional Court of South Africa, established after the democratic transition as the guardian of the new constitutional order, was built on this site in a deliberate act of spatial reclamation. Justice, literally constructed on the foundations of injustice. The court's architecture incorporating bricks, salvaged from the demolished prison walls, as a material acknowledgement of the history the building now supersedes. The Constitutional Court building itself is a work of remarkable architectural intention. Its interior spaces filled with South African art, its design incorporating the textures and colors of the country's diverse cultural traditions, its public spaces open and accessible in deliberate contrast to the exclusionary spatial logic of the prison that preceded it. The bricks from the demolished prison walls, embedded in the court's new construction, are visible throughout the building. A literal architectural integration of past and present, the material of oppression repurposed as the foundation of a constitutional order built on the principle of equal dignity for all. When the court's judges deliberate on matters of constitutional interpretation, they do so in a building whose very walls carry the memory of what South Africa was and the aspiration of what it has committed to become. The Mandela Foundation, established after Mandela's retirement from the presidency in 1999, became the institutional vehicle through which his post-presidential engagement with the world's ongoing struggles was organized and sustained. The Foundation's work in education, in HIV/AIDS awareness, in the promotion of democratic values and human rights, extended the geographic reach of Mandela's influence into the spaces where the work of building a more just world is conducted in the absence of the dramatic historical moments that attract international attention. The 46,664 campaign, named for Mandela's prison number on Robben Island, mobilized international attention and resources around the HIV/AIDS crisis in Africa, using the symbolic weight of his imprisonment as a frame for a public health emergency that was, in the early years of the 21st century, devastating the continent with a thoroughness that the apartheid state might have envied. The post-apartheid South Africa that Mandela's presidency inaugurated has been, in the 3 decades since his inauguration, a landscape of genuine achievement and persistent struggle. A country that has accomplished the extraordinary transition from racial dictatorship to constitutional democracy while confronting the stubborn persistence of the inequalities that apartheid designed into the landscape. The geography of poverty in South Africa remains, in its broad outlines, recognizable from the apartheid era. The townships still exist, their spatial relationship to the cities of wealth and opportunity still reflecting the logic of a system that organized distance as a form of control. The matchbox houses of Soweto still stand, their residents still navigating the gap between the constitutional promises of the post-apartheid order and the material realities of an economy whose structural inequalities were not dissolved by the act of democratic transition. This is not a failure of Mandela's legacy, but a measure of the depth of the problem his presidency began the work of addressing. The transformation of a society organized for 3 centuries around the systematic extraction of wealth from the majority for the benefit of a minority is not accomplished in a single presidential term, or in a generation, or perhaps in several generations. What Mandela's presidency accomplished was the establishment of the constitutional and institutional framework within which that transformation could be pursued. The rule of law, the independent judiciary, the free press, the Bill of Rights that made the dignity of every South African a matter of legal obligation rather than political discretion. These were not small achievements. In the context of what South Africa was and what it might have become, they were extraordinary ones. The global landscape of Mandela's legacy extends far beyond the borders of South Africa, into the broader geography of the world's ongoing struggles for human dignity and democratic governance. His example, the specific combination of moral clarity, strategic patience, and the capacity for forgiveness without forgetting, has been invoked in contexts as varied as Northern Ireland's peace process, the reconciliation efforts in post-genocide Rwanda, and the democratic transitions of Eastern Europe. The particular quality of his leadership in the moment of South Africa's transition, the deliberate choice of reconciliation over revenge at a moment when history offered him the choice and his own suffering would have justified the alternative, has become a reference point in the global conversation about how societies emerge from the shadow of systematic injustice. Mandela Day, observed annually on July 18, his birthday, has become a global occasion for the expression of the values his life embodied, with individuals and organizations across the world committing 67 minutes of service to their communities, 1 minute for each year of his public life. The physical geography of Mandela Day is the geography of ordinary human community. The soup kitchens and school gardens and neighborhood cleanup projects, where the abstract values of justice and dignity are expressed in the concrete language of practical action. It is a modest, distributed, and entirely appropriate form of commemoration for a man whose greatness was always inseparable from his rootedness in the specific, the local, and the human. The documentary now returns, as it must, to where it began. The hills of the Transkei roll on in their ancient continuity, the red earth unchanged, the Embash River winding through the grassland toward the Indian Ocean coast. The rondavels on the hillsides catch the morning light as they have caught it for generations, their whitewashed walls luminous against the ochre of the surrounding landscape. The cattle move across the open grazing commons with the unhurried purposefulness of animals that have been doing this for centuries and will continue doing it long after the particular human dramas of the 20th century have faded from living memory into the longer memory of the land itself. Above Quinu, the sky is as wide and as full of possibility as it was on July 18, 1918, when a boy named Rolihlala opened his eyes to this landscape for the first time and began the extraordinary journey that would take him from these hills to the limestone quarry of Robben Island, from the quarry to the courtrooms of Pretoria, from the courtrooms to the cell, from the cell to the negotiating tables of the democratic transition, and from the transition to the union buildings and the presidency and the long, productive years of post-presidential engagement with the world's unfinished business. The journey ended where it began, in the red earth of the Eastern Cape, beneath the open sky of the Transkei, in the landscape that had been the first and most fundamental architecture of a soul capable of enduring everything the century demanded of it, and emerging on the other side of that endurance, not diminished, but enlarged. The horizon above Quinu remains what it has always been, open, unhurried, and vast. It does not commemorate, it does not mourn, it simply continues, as horizons do, offering to each new generation that stands before it the same wordless invitation that it offered to a curious boy more than a century ago. The invitation to look outward, to imagine what lies beyond the visible edge of the world, and to begin the long walk toward it.